1.5 million Indian soldiers fought in the trenches of World War I, and just 2 decades later, 2.5 million Indians enthusiastically joined the fight against fascism by enrolling themselves in what would become the largest all-voluntary armed force in history. These courageous men traveled to distant lands to fight in inhospitable terrains, knowing fully well that they may never return home. And many did not. While no precise count exists, over 160,000 Indian soldiers are estimated to have died in the two world wars. Many more were wounded. If it were any other nation, such brave hearts would be immortalized forever and revered as national heroes. But in India, their memories are conflicted. Their chivalry is not open to question, but their motivation to fight under the banner of the colonial government makes them unlikely heroes of a nation that has been shaped by and still draws its identity largely from its freedom struggle against the same colonial government. How does one reconcile with the fact that these soldiers, through their devoted services and unbending loyalty, were further strengthening a foreign power that was subjugating, exploiting their own countrymen? Britain never had a large contingent in India. It was the Indian soldiers of the British Indian Army who ensured that no native ruler in India could challenge the British authority. After securing indisputable hegemony for Britain over all of India, they helped it extend its power over our neighbors from Afghanistan to Burma. Sure, the Indian soldiers fought valiantly in the world wars, but the people they fought in places extending from Egypt to Malaysia bore no ill will towards Indians. They were not India's enemies. We laud the mutineers of 1857 as India's first independence heroes. Then how does one also commemorate those who chose the East India Company over India and enable it to defeat these mutineers and brutally crush India's first rebellion for independence? Similarly, we cannot simultaneously valorize the Indian National Army led by Subhash Chandra Bose and also those who defeated it so that India continued to remain firmly under the yoke of British tyranny. However, soldiers fight for the government of the day. All over the world, good soldiers are expected to follow orders and not question the motives behind them. The political situation and societal values have considerably changed since the days of the British Indian Army. Is it fair for us to apply our contemporary lens and discredit the services of these brave Indian men? Since independence, these questions have been evaded by successive Indian regimes, but we believe an open and dispassionate public debate is long overdue, and this session is our attempt at just that. Hello and welcome to Argumentative Indians. My name is Yajur Arora, and I'm deeply honored to host this panel of highly eminent guests. General Singh, although we remember the soldiers who have fallen in wars against Pakistan, especially in the Kargil War, there is very little done to preserve the memory of the much larger number of Indians deployed and killed and injured during the wars before independence. Why is that?
Okay, there is no doubt at all, either in my mind or in the understanding of the Indian Armed Forces, that soldiers of the British Indian Army deserve our appreciation and also the honor that has been their due, even after independence. A few points in support of what I have said and to put it in perspective. The Indian Army, and when I talk of the Army, to an extent, it also includes the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy. The Indian Army draws its legacy and traces its roots to the British Indian Army pre-1947. That legacy has been built on the courage and sacrifice of thousands of Indian soldiers in various conflicts. Initially, only soldiers and later officers who also got commissioned. And this connect of the Indian Army with the British Indian Army in no way, I repeat, in no way detracts from the ethos and the core values of the present Indian Army. The units of the Indian Army carry with great pride the battle honors they earn as part of the British Indian Army. And let me just relate it to my two regiments. I got commissioned into 7th Light Cavalry, which was raised in 1784 as part of the Madras Presidency, has fought numerous wars before independence and continues its chivalrous record after independence. Obviously, we are very proud of their performance post-independence as part of the Indian Army of an independent nation. But we also honor and respect the lineage that we draw from their exploits prior to independence. Let me give you an example. And it was way back in 97. I was commanding the same regiment in an exercise in the Rajasthan desert. And lo and behold, I was in a conference or a meeting, and in walked in an old soldier around 90, 95 years old. He had an absolutely crumpled uniform, was wearing a cap, and he was brought to me and he said, "Sir, I am from a nearby village. I was part of this regiment before independence, and I fought in World War II. And it was such a great occasion to rejoice and meet him. We had a Sainik Sammelan where this guy spoke for some time. In our quarter guards, you will find all the battle honors named. We celebrate Zojila Day after the famous Battle of Zojila. And let me tell you, old-timers who also, of course, their numbers have dwindled. I think hardly any would be alive today. But as they were, they used to come year after year to be part of these celebrations and share their exploits with the troops of today. Let me also state that all our senior officers, including the chiefs of the Army, Navy, Air Force, who till the 1980s, who were at the helm of our armed forces, all got commissioned as part of the British Indian Army and fought in World War II. And you take the names, Karyappa, our first chief, followed by Thumaya, and a whole lot of others, Field Marshal, later Field Marshal Manekshaw, and Prem Bhagat, who won a Victoria Cross in North Africa. And he's made much of. Now I come to your main question, and that is, do we celebrate their sacrifices adequately or not? I would actually put a caveat to it. I think within the armed forces, the Army, Navy, Air Force, we honor them and celebrate them. Their pictures adorn our regiments. The quarter guards are full of their exploits. Some of their medals have been gifted to the regiment. And well, they are looked upon as our very famous soldiers whom we make much of. As far as the civil population is concerned, India has had, I would say, an indifferent record of celebrating its soldiers. There are complex reasons, and maybe the professor would be well placed to talk of those. For a long time, we had only the names of those who lost their lives in the Afghan War and World War I, which were engraved on India Gate. In fact, when I met our Honorable Prime Minister for the first time, this was one of the points I gave to him. And I said to him, sir, you need to put down a war memorial where we can put down the names of those who have fallen after independence. Now, what has got missed out is the names of those over 70, 80,000 who fell during World War II. They are neither on India Gate nor on the war memorial, but I am certain that sooner than later, those names will also get engraved there. And I think when we celebrate it was, I think, about 4 years or 2018 when we celebrated the 100 years of the ending of World War I. And there was a big commemoration that was held all over the world, focused in London, but also in New Delhi. And there were large exhibitions. Some of their exploits were made into short documentaries, and they were spread all over the country. So we did remember them. As late as a year or two back, when our Prime Minister went to Israel, he visited Haifa, the place where the last cavalry charge took place of Indian cavalry, and he laid a wreath there. I myself, in service, I went to France and then requested to go to the Commonwealth graves where some of these Indian braves were honored and buried. So I would say that yes, more can be done. More can be done to commemorate them. But it's not the same in every country. India is still developing, though we've had a martial tradition for long. But I think honoring, there is a saying that soldiers are remembered only in times of war and soon forgotten thereafter. Well, that's not absolutely true, but I think that's something we can do more of. I think more would be still less. That's what I would say. But just one more point before I hand over, and that was the question that you raised as to the politicization of the participation of Indian soldiers under the British Indian Army. Well, I think the history of India is to be seen as a comprehensive history. In 1857, whom did we rally against? Whom did we rally under? Everybody came to Delhi to rally under Bahadur Shah Zafar. What gave him the legitimacy? The conquest of the Mughals who came and took over India. You read the Mughal history, I just finished reading Akbar. And mind you, his strategy was to get a large number of Rajput and other Hindu rulers with their armies to come to his court and fight for the Mughal Empire. So as far as the peasantry is concerned, who got recruited in the army, it was an honorable profession. They served the government of the day, as you said. And let me also add that the soldier was not concerned with the finer nuance of what was correct and what was not. In fact, when the INA trials took place and they finished after independence, while we did honor them, there were contrasting views on the INA. And today, while we all appreciate what the INA meant and what they did, but mind you, as far as only soldiering goes, India did not think it prudent to get them back into the Indian Army after independence. They were all either discharged or sent home, and even their pensions were only sanctioned, if I am not wrong, in 1980. So I think one of the great traditions of the Indian Army, in fact, I think it's our most valuable core value, that is, we are apolitical, even today. And I think the Indian Army is such a professional force because we have been apolitical. We serve the constitution of the country and the government of the day. And in all my talks, wherever I go, I do make it within the armed forces, I do make it a point to say that this is a core value we need to cherish and also preserve. Well, that should suffice for my opening statement.
Thank you, sir. I'll move on to Ms. Shrabani Basu. Ma'am, many people attribute Britain's ultimate retreat from India to have been triggered by a series of events after which they couldn't take the loyalty of the Indian armed forces for granted as they had done until then. So as a corollary of that, wouldn't it be the unflinching loyalty of the Indian armed forces that allowed the British Empire to go on to rule for as long as they did, and to continue to exploit and plunder the subcontinent for more than a century?
Well, of course, the British ruled India with a large Indian population. There was just a small minority of British who managed to rule this whole country. So they had not just the army there, they also had the people. There were many who were working with them, and there was no resistance, which is why they were there. But the point is, I mean, if we are going to focus, it's a large area, we're going to focus on commemoration. The argument that we pander to colonialism by honoring the soldiers of the empire who fought for them is actually contrary to the view that I hold, is that the post-colonial narrative, we have to see that Indian soldiers really played a major role in this war. Because if you read the Western narratives, it was the Normandy landings, it is, this fascism was taken on by the European powers. It was actually fought on the shoulders of the Indian army as well. The colonial soldiers from all over, and a large majority obviously from India, who really took on this battle. So I see their the recognition of these soldiers as really important, both from Indian history and from here where I live in Britain as well. So when I started, when the centenary of the First World War was coming up, I knew that there'd be lots of books out, talking about the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Ypres. And there was not going to be a single book about the contribution of the Indians. And as you said, 1.5 million Indians came here to fight in the trenches. They came wearing their cotton khaki uniforms in the bitter cold winter. And there was no way that, I was going to let their story not be told. So it was actually a learning process for me, because I didn't know. I grew up in India, and, we've all heard of the Tommies. I had no idea that there were men in turbans also fighting in these trenches, in these horrible conditions. We've, read a lot about the war poets. We didn't know anything about the contribution of Indians, that they wrote all these letters back home, which are all in the British Library, which I accessed for my book. And I was also, so these stories, I went to Garhwal, I went to, these villages in India which produced these soldiers, and they went on to win 11 Victoria Crosses. So I think it was really important that their stories were told. Also, for the first time, I discovered that there were 4 Indian pilots. It's something I had no idea. And there is this, 18-year-old boy, Indralal Roy, who sort of volunteers for the war. He becomes India's first flying ace, takes down 10 German aircrafts. He's 19 years old when he dies. And the Germans dropped a wreath on his grave. His nephew, Subrata Mukherjee, became the first chief of the Indian Air Force. These are stories that we should all know about, the bravery of these people. I think it's a real disservice not to know about them and, learn their narratives and the stories and the sacrifices they made. So that's just the First World War. But because after I wrote this book and because of my interest in it, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they look after graves all over the Commonwealth of soldiers who fell in the First World War and Second World War. And they were bringing out a report on how there was actually a historic non-commemoration. So there was, while they pledged that, all the soldiers would be remembered equally, whatever their rank, they would have the same gravestone. It actually didn't apply. It applied in Western Europe, but not in the other fields of war. And so I was one of the authors of this report, that we found that there were over 50,000 Indians whose names were not recorded. They had fought in Basra, they had fought in the Far East, in Iraq, in Egypt. And so, the colonial narrative that they just because they didn't matter, there was an army officer, General Cox, who said, Hindus and Sikhs don't care about headstones. And that was such nonsense. It was such a racist remark, which had to be brought out because I found in my research that they were saying they wanted to be remembered. There was a Garhwali soldier who said, I know that I will not be cremated and I might have to be buried where I fall, but please don't put my shoes in my grave. So these are the sort of appeals they were making. These are the, the letters that I discovered in the British Library. And so we could, absolutely challenge these, assertions that they didn't want a headstone. Of course, they wanted to be remembered. Of course, they wanted to be known. They were going to die in far-off fields. This is the first war that they fought outside their country, the first time they crossed the seas. So, taking this on, this report, the publication happened last year, April 2021, and it led to an apology from the British government. It led to an apology from the defense minister, the prime minister, and also the pledge that they would then right these wrongs. So that is really important. So when, somebody like me, I do obviously, talk a lot about how these stories and the contribution of Indians must not be forgotten. It's actually very much a post-colonial narrative. I see it that we have to stake our claim in this war and say that, Indians fought. Second World War, the forgotten war in, it's called the Forgotten War. What happened in the Far East? I mean, it wasn't all about the Normandy landings, where also there were Indians involved. It's also about what happened in the jungles of Burma, the Battle of Kohima, which is listed as one of the toughest battles of the Second World War. Why is this forgotten in the whole narrative? So it's important that, it's known in the West and it's known in India. I mean, the fact that I grew up in India and I didn't know all these stories to the extent was something that I was really shocked when I came here. So I feel, more and more, as Colonel Singh also said, that, more needs to be done. A lot has been done, but and I think this is happening. A lot of interest has surfaced. There's a lot of recording now of these. And as the CWGC, tries to commemorate those who weren't, I hope we make, further. I work with academic institutions and local governments and try to see how we commemorate all these people, have their names recorded, because they were not just numbers that went there. These are people behind these. And well, I've written about Noor Khan, who was a secret agent in the Second World War. Her story was not known at all. And now she's known around the world. There are people who write to me every day. There's films on her, there's theater, there's going to be a TV series. So yes, we do know, I'll keep it brief. We do need to know these stories. We do need to commemorate them. And yes, now that I'm talking to an Indian audience, the British government, I campaigned for a memorial for Noor Khan. It was unveiled. It's the first Indian memorial in a public space for an Indian woman. It was unveiled by Princess Anne. We also had a blue plaque outside her house, first blue plaque for an Indian woman. So it's a matter of pride for us. And I would like to see the UK government Royal Mail brought out a stamp on Noor Khan for her centenary. So I'd like to see the Indian government bring out a stamp for Noor Khan and for all these other heroes as well. So I'll end it there. I think we need to, the greatest disservice we can do is to forget the contribution of these people.
Thank you. So there is no doubt that the history needs to be unearthed and well researched and documented from Indian standpoint. And in Britain's case, I think they did serve them very well. Millions lost their lives for them. So they should have been given credit. But let me get in Dr. Kamtekar, and I want to bring it back towards India. So in the way the history is taught in schools, many people take away, get this impression that the people who served the British Empire were somehow circumstantially forced into it, either because of the poverty or large unemployment under the British rule or overt threats. But the general impression is that somehow they were forced. So first of all, I want you to address this impression. To what extent is this true? Or were these people enthusiastically and willingly in going in and enrolling? Because when we look at the facts, Britain never had conscription in India. The people who went and joined the British Army it was an entirely voluntary army. They never even had to do draft, not even in the midst of in the middle of the World War II, where the army size went up to 2.5 million people. This was still entirely voluntary. So to what extent were these people forced into it? And if they were not forced into it, then that brings me to the question that what kind of, I want to question their moral decision. I agree with General Singh that it wasn't clear who was the legitimate government at the time. But it should have still been very clear who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. When you are living through that period, it's not that hard to figure out. So when you see that there is a suppressor and there is a suppressed, but you go and decide to serve the oppressed, what is your motivation? Is it, are you, like, at best you are selfish that you're still serving an oppressing army because it pays you well, gives you good pension, etc. And at best, you are a professional who wants the India to get free, but knows how to keep his emotions out of his line of duty. So at best, they were very professional. At worst, they were selfish. But they do not come across as very humane or as patriots. So what makes them deserving of an honor from the Indian perspective?
Yes. Thank you, Yajur Arora, to you and your team for, first, let me say, for setting up a much needed forum like Argumentative Indians. And thank you for inviting me to participate in it. What I particularly like is that you wish to go beyond propaganda to explore subjects to gain a greater understanding of them, rather than to provoke the shouting matches which we are often condemned to watch on TV. So I'm all for this. We do need to enhance our awareness of issues, to see them from many angles, and to get a sense of what is at stake from differing viewpoints. That's what we try to do, I must say, if you'll permit some advertising, at my university, wonderful university, JNU, and particularly at the Center for Historical Studies of JNU, to which I'm privileged to belong. Now, let me start off by saying that I accept what General Singh has said, that the army continues to celebrate its traditions going back a couple of 100 years, sometimes more. I accept what Shrabani Basu says, that there is a huge human interest story about Indian participation in the world wars. I accept what you say about school history not really giving much importance to Indian World War participation. But I'm going to differ with the interpretations which are put on this. So let me start off by arguing against the idea that we should honor the soldiers of the Indian Army under British rule. And then, depending on how things go, I may make use of the way you frame your project in terms of understanding issues rather than scoring debating points. I might just use it by defecting to the other side, to General Singh and Shrabani Basu's side, and saying we should honor those soldiers. So defection is a no-no in warfare. Of course, it does happen. But in a debate, it's harmless. It may be interesting. It may be fun. So I'm reserving the option, if you don't mind, to play both sides if I so choose. But let me begin by opposing this whole idea. And the central word in the way you've put this whole proposition is honor. It's not acknowledge, which I think Shrabani Basu has been talking about. And I have no problem with acknowledging the role of the army recruited by the British. In history, everybody should be acknowledged. Everybody should find space. Varying, conflicting narratives should jostle with each other for space. The problem is with honoring the soldiers. Whom do we honor? We honor those whom we admire, those whose causes we endorse. The German soldiers of World War II are not honored. Why do we honor people in history? I think there are three reasons, and they're based on three things: gratitude, expectation, validation. GEV for short, if you wish. Gratitude, expectation, validation. So first, gratitude. Conventionally in our school histories, we owe gratitude to Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, Congress leaders, because it said if it wasn't for them, India would have been ruled by the British for longer than we were. The rule by foreigners would have been economically debilitating, psychologically damaging, and so on. Now, okay, that's standard history. I would say we should, I certainly do, owe great gratitude to Alexander Fleming for the discovery of penicillin, 1928-29, because I wouldn't be around if it wasn't for that, and so wouldn't many of us in the audience. If you want to stretch it a bit, we could be grateful to Bill Gates, to Steve Jobs for the way we lead our digital lives, maybe even to Eric Yuan for founding Zoom. 300, 400 million people use it every day. You're using it for this platform. We all are. So gratitude arguments can be stretched. They can be stretched quite far. Can they be stretched as far as the British Indian Army? It was called the Indian Army, but let's not nitpick about that. Can it be stretched as far as the British Indian Army? Now, what was the cause here for which this army fought? It was the maintenance and expansion of British power. The British in India were about 1.5 lakhs in the 20th century, let's say 1939 figures. The soldiers were only 60,000. Of course, as Shrabani said, there were many Indians who supported British rule. But remember that the total army population was about 2 lakhs when Indians were about 400 million. If you 2 lakhs, maybe add another 50,000 if you want to add the forces of the princely states. Now, this army went to Afghanistan, it went to China. It is often said it was an imperial fire brigade. It suppressed internal dissent. In fact, it was active in Northwest India. If a young British officer was ambitious, he often came here to gain combat experience. So ambitious young officers came here. Churchill would be one. Now, it's true that Indian soldiers were sent in World War I to the trenches in France, that people went to the Middle East and so on. Did this army protect India? I suppose the greatest case which could have been made was that it protected India against the Japanese in World War II. So there was a time in World War II, Pearl Harbor was 7th March 1941. Within 3 months, was 7th December, sorry. By 8th March, Rangoon had fallen. There was a feeling in India that if the citadel of Singapore had fallen, then Calcutta would fall too. And the Indian army stopped that. But then there's the counter argument. Would the Japanese have threatened India if it wasn't British ruled? Gandhiji and others said the presence of the British is a provocation to the Japanese. So the corollary from this is perhaps there wasn't such a need for protection. Now, here's the problem. The cause, this maintenance and expansion of British power, is that one which we support? So I would say there, no gratitude, thanks for nothing. The maintenance and expansion of British power is not one which we can easily buy into. Then there are expectation arguments. Here, the idea is that you honor those who provide role models for kids in the future. So, okay, C.V. Raman gets the Nobel Prize, Hargobind Khurana. That means that young Indians become aware they can produce scientific ideas of the highest quality. Maybe people become encouraged to take careers in science. If the government of India bestows, as it has now, it gives the Padma Bhushan to Satya Nadella of Microsoft, Sundar Pichai of Google. It is saying that Indians can lead, become bosses of the biggest corporations in the world. So it is supposedly motivational for people to climb the international corporate ladder. They would have done so anyway, but they have won great fame and tons of money, and people will be inspired by that. So let's leave that aside. If you make the same case for honoring Mary Kom as a sportswoman, Balkrishna Doshi as an architect, okay, they are role models. But do you seriously think that erecting monuments to soldiers who have fallen fighting under British officers against Germans in France in 1914 is going to motivate soldiers today to fight the Chinese if they have to do so? Do you seriously think that? Think again. Colonially recruited soldiers cannot provide nationalist models. Don't even try that project. Now I come to validation. And this links to what Shrabani in particular said. The Oxford historian Yasmin Khan has an excellent book on India in World War II. It is First Strict History. And she says that Britain did not win World War II, the British Empire did. She's making the argument, which Shrabani has also made, that it's not just the white British alone, that our soldiers, Indian soldiers, fought in that war. And this makes complete sense to me from the point of view of immigrants to the UK. From that viewpoint, the fact that Indian soldiers from our subcontinent fought for the British is important. So they're saying, we saved this country, Britain, and so the British people should honor our ancestors and thereby acknowledge us to a greater extent. It makes a case for Indians, for their descendants, to claim their rightful place in British history and in current British politics. Now, how much that is actually needed, I don't know, because Britain, having had the finance and home portfolios held by people like Rishi Sunak, who swore his oath in the British Parliament on the Bhagavad Gita, or people with names like Preeti Patel or Sajid Javid, that's another matter whether it's really needed. But I see the case for validation. From the point of view of a multicultural society, which Britain self-consciously is, it makes perfect sense in terms of validation to insist on adequate recognition of Asians, Indians in that society. But let's come home. And we have to distinguish, and we'll do more of that as we go along, in distinguishing motivation for enlistment motivation from combat motivation. It's an important distinction. There are studies, and this comes to Yajur, exactly what you're asking about what does the Indian soldier get out of joining the army. Many years ago, there was a PhD thesis of London University by somebody called Amia Bharat, where she studied 19th century and how much did the soldier earn. And in short, her findings were that a sepoy got a salary of 7 rupees. She did a cost comparison, 7 rupees, 3 rupees out of the 7 would give 60 pounds of wheat per month. There would be a cut of 1 rupee for dhobi, nai clothes. 3 rupees would be sent home for the family. In other words, it was a good job. Now, in our society, this was a very big thing. The pre-British armies usually hired troops for campaigns. They didn't have pakki naukri. That's what the British gave. What else did they give? They gave pensions. Earlier, Indian rulers might give a pension. It was discretionary, maybe to a widow, maybe to somebody killed in action. There were no rights. The sepoy of the Indian army got a pension after 20 years of service. Now, in our society, then as now, everybody wants a formal job. It's a good job in a society where there are few opportunities. I've done research on World War II, and one of the things I found going through the articles by army doctors, which are published in the Indian Journal of Medical Research, they're available in the ICMR library near the All India Medical Institute, they actually weighed soldiers. So when at time of bharti, the soldier would be weighed, and then they would weigh them every 4 months. And what did they find? They found that the weight of an average soldier from the Northwest increased by about 5 pounds within 4 months of joining the army. So you've written in the write-up that the soldiers were enthusiastic about fighting fascism. I doubt if that was the case, but there's an understandable motivation. Getting food and medicine means so much. They wanted a better standard of living. Now, I completely understand that. I also value pakki naukri. But is it something to be proud of? Why should we be proud of people who are just like us? In short, let me sum up this. There's no reason for us to be grateful for the colonial Indian army. Tell its story, yes. There's no reason to think that we'll have a better army today against the Chinese or Pakistanis if the soldiers of today think about the colonial past. And how can we today feel good or in India validated by our soldiers taking orders from British officers and accepting their inferior positions in France in 1914? That's totally beyond me. So I'm making the case, let me finish. I'm making the case that honoring these soldiers is like scripting a pointless sound and light show. It's fun to watch, but it's not going to get us anywhere. It's good entertainment, it's good knowledge. Now, let me say that's me speaking from the point of view of our conventional nationalist thinking. As the discussion flows, I will probably defect to the other point of view, but let me start there.
Thank you. I just want to dive a little bit more deeper into this question of the motivation of the soldier, and I'd like to come back to General Singh for that. So do you believe that soldiers have no responsibility for the actions they take under orders? When General Dyer had shouted fire, it was the soldiers, Indian soldiers of the Indian Army, that executed his command without hesitation, firing till they ran out of ammunition. On whom? On hundreds of innocent women, children, civilians trapped inside a closed area. How does that not cause a conscience crisis for a soldier? Not as a professional, not as a nationalist, but as a human.
Yeah.
And if just me finish. And how is that different from a Nazi soldier who slaughtered thousands of innocent humans without a hint of remorse, and later explained that simply by saying, "I was following orders"?
Yeah, you've raised a very, very pertinent point, and that is about obeying illegal orders, or what appears to you to be illegal orders. Okay. Now, making a sharp comment on the Jallianwala Bagh incident, clearly it could not have been justified under any circumstances. And let me also state that any of the troops who had objected to it or disobeyed this order would have been taken to task. That was the system. That is how the British, they could not have afforded to allow an individual to question a British officer. And I would state that in independent India today, such an order, firstly, would never be given. And secondly, where any order which is blatantly illegal, I'm not talking of orders, when you go to war, you don't expect soldiers to start nuancing on the order. Then you will not do your job. But where order appears to be blatantly illegal, then it's the duty of the subordinates to stand up and be counted and say no. In this case, I would not put it down so much to the soldier, but to the intermediary level of command who were present there between Brigadier Dyer and the common soldier. There were Indian junior commissioned officers who were present there, who were with the troops, and there would have been some young and middle-level British officers who were also present there. And I think it's a sad commentary that not one of them put in his papers or objected to this. At least it's not recorded. So I think this is a very pertinent question, and let me get you to a recent incident, which is also became politicized. If you remember, the Babri Masjid was demolished in the 90s, I think, sometime then. And it led to a riotous situation in UP. Okay? And at some time, the central government, it was a Congress government, that decided to informally ask the army chief that would the army step in and control the situation. I am told, I was not privy to this, but it is generally known that the chief of that day said no. It is a religious issue, a political issue, and the armed forces are composed of troops of all religions. And hence, we would not like to get embroiled in this. And the army did the right thing. cut back to another day. Now, these are questions which are not so easily answered. And maybe Shrabani Basu and Professor would be able to give their view. Take the assault on the army action in the Golden Temple. And I'm bringing it more to the current because the issue is relevant even today. Not so much, it was relevant then, but it is more relevant today. Yes, the Golden Temple had been taken over and had been, let's say, fortified. There was firing going on from there. And there were all kinds of intelligence reports that were coming in to suggest that sooner than later, some announcements will be made. And it could lead to a larger uprising in Punjab. How true or not, I can't say. And the army chose to go into Golden Temple. I think the opinion is divided on this, and there is no clear-cut answer. If the nation is threatened, or the sanctity and security of the nation is threatened, then the armed forces have a duty to react. But was that the best way to handle it? After all, later, you saw KPS Gill handle this in a more nuanced way without going inside. But it's not easy to pass a judgment with perspective. I think the choice that was faced by General Vaidya, General Sundarji, General Bragg, who were on the spot, and they took a decision to go in. So this is a very live question. I'm quite clear in my mind that illegal order, especially at the level of officers, who can distinguish what is right and what is wrong, who can distinguish what the army can do and should not do or cannot do. I think they have a bounden duty to stand up and object. Bounden duty to stand up and object. That is the difference between a professional army and a ragtag force of insurgents, or whatever you call them. You cannot take law into your own hands, and there are many situations. For example, a proxy war is going on in Kashmir, and let's say your two soldiers who are standing on duty at a checkpost, a terrorist or an insurgent comes using a car, shoots two of them down in cold blood, who are just checking the car. Now it will inflame their comrades who are nearby. Does it give them the right then to get hold of all civilians who are around and shoot them? No way. There is a difference between that guy, because that is his strategy. What is our strategy is to protect the populace. We are there because of that. So this fine distinction has to be made by the officers who are present. Sometimes the soldiers get inflamed by the situation. And I think it's the duty of the senior officer present there who should actually object to any illegal order. I heard the professor talk of the German army, World War II. They are not remembered or honored in Germany, but they are valued and they are followed in the United Kingdom, in USA, and in India. And let me give you an example. In 1985, I did my staff college at Cavalry in UK, having topped our internal exam. And what were we taught? The exploits of German generals. We were taught the exploits of Russian generals. We were taught the exploits of American generals. And you'll be surprised, the only British general whom they found fit to be taught to us was Bill Slim of Burma fame. Why? Because he fought the war without support and resources. The professors called it the Forgotten Army. Absolutely right. The remembrance of our soldiers in Kohima and Imphal, I think, is certainly something that is linked to our general, or has been linked to our general neglect of the Northeast. And hopefully, as the Northeast comes into prominence, the defense of post in Punjab cannot be likened in our imagination to what happened in the Northeast. So these two battles actually were the gateway for the conquest of India, and the Japanese never recovered after losing these battles. Thank you.
To Ms. Basu very quickly. So General Singh talked about a case where there was clearly what would have been an illegal order now. And now the values are so that protection of the civilians is prime. But that cannot be the case for the people who joined the army before the independence. The values were to ensure the British hegemony was not shaken in any way. So the interests they were protecting, you talked a lot about how they risked in France and Belgium, and they deserve to be known in Britain because they served their lives. But it was the purpose of the British. These places did not threaten German forces, did not threaten India, nor was there any threat towards India in the World War I from Turkey to Egypt. These places were not India's enemies, as I earlier pointed out. But the presence of Indians in these places did affect the perception of how Indians were seen as advancing a cause of an aggressive empire. They were not really. If I just bring in one example of, let's say, China. In China, they still vividly remember as a collective memory of Indian soldiers coming and destroying their towns along the coast during the Opium Wars. In their language, they call the British the white barbarians, but Indians were the black barbarians who served as the dogs of the white barbarians. They have a word for Indians, Zhao Gao, which still comes up whenever there is an Indo-China tensions at the border. They still bring back those words because the memories are so painful of the harm that was inflicted on them by these Indian soldiers. According to the Chinese reports, large number of women were raped, temples were destroyed, towns were burnt. None of this served any purpose of Indians. It was entirely to the British cause, which ended up enriching Britain. So how do we combine these two things? Yes, there was, does it not matter when you are a soldier? Does the overall aim of the war that you're involved in has no consequence of in your participation or in your decision to participate?
Well, two things actually, very quickly. I think, well, there are illegal wars though the world over, and they are still happening. I mean, we are in the middle of a conflict happening right now in Europe. But the soldiers are not the ones who are responsible. The leaders are responsible. It's the politicians, it's the generals who who sort of command these troops, and the others, they just follow. I just want to quickly go back to Germany and then the Second World War. It was mentioned that we don't honor the German soldiers, of course, but let's not forget that it is the Nuremberg Trials that happened were very specifically for the Nazi party. So when I talk about leaders, it's not the ordinary soldiers. They are doing their job. The Nuremberg Trials were for the leaders of the military in the Nazi party and the leaders of the Nazi party, the politicians. And Churchill himself said that he would be preferred to be shot rather than take on an ordinary German soldier who was just doing his duty. But the trials had to take out those who were responsible for war crimes. So that's a whole different area. The ordinary soldier is just doing what he does. He's following his command. And there'd be chaos if he didn't, for whatever reason. I mean, this modern day wars or wars that have taken place in history, they've all been, they're wars. Nobody wants wars, at any cost. But the soldiers, they've been commanded by politicians for whatever reason. So let's not go into that debate. But you cannot blame the soldier for what he does. I mean, that's just one point. Your very interesting point about the Opium Wars. Let's not forget that a lot of Indian business houses profited from them. Okay, the Parsis built a lot of their wealth on the opium trade, supporting the East India Company, and they made a lot of money. And they're there, big business houses in Bombay now made their money from opium. When Dadabhai Naoroji came here, he came here with a company, Kama which, he actually quit that company because he said they're profiting from the opium trade, and he preferred to take up an academic job. And then he became an MP. But so there have been people, Dwarkanath Tagore, the grandfather of Rabindranath Tagore, he profited from the opium trade. So there have been a lot of business houses in India. Let's not be, let's not say that Indians were not profiting. Oh, they were. There were very many people who were profiting from the British, from the East India Company, from the British Empire in many ways. So that's another point. And as for the soldiers, I would say, the Gurkha regiment that fired in Jallianwala Bagh, it's not them you blame, it's General Dyer. Okay, they were doing the duty. They probably had nightmares, as soldiers do. Soldiers suffer from post-traumatic disorder because of what they've gone through. There were the British troops who went to, Iraq and fought in Afghanistan. They were following orders. You don't blame them. You talk about governments that sent them there. Vietnam wars have been, traditionally done by governments, by politicians. Never blame the soldier for what he had to do when he went there. That's my take on it. Of course, I mean, if you have war crimes committed by soldiers, that's another area. But then we are then entering another area altogether. So it's really very nuanced, and there's no black and white to this. But I think we can take a general stand on, where we need to remember them, where we need to, those who are really brave. What have we gained? I mean, there was another point raised about, does that past colonial record inspire the modern soldiers? Well, actually, funnily enough, I went to Garhwal, I went to Lansdowne, which is when I was researching my book, and that is where the Garhwal regiment is based. And all along the way, as you drive up the hill, you have these paintings of the two Garhwali soldiers who got the Victoria Cross. They're not remembered anywhere, but there in Garhwal, there's Darwan Singh Negi and Gabbar Singh Negi, who got the Victoria Cross in the First World War. And their paintings, sort of posters are all over as you drive up to Lansdowne. And they have a recruitment for the Garhwal regiment, which is actually held, it's like a mela, which is held on Gabbar Singh's birthday. So there in April, in his little village, they have a recruitment fair. And they relayed these, it's amazing. They relayed these stories of how he, what he did and how he died. So it was a posthumous VC. But how he, this bravery is there to actually inspire the local Garhwalis, which is, it was interesting for me, as an outsider looking in, I found that really interesting that they had focused on his birthday to actually recruit for the present Garhwal regiment. So that's the inspirational thing. The other thing is there's often an accusation that they were mercenaries because this is a volunteer army. So why did they join? Yes, as you say, they joined 11 rupees, a pair of shoes, and 3 meals a day. This is what forced many of them to join. Many of them, it wasn't so voluntary because there was very much a stick. If it's left to the village chieftain to recruit, they have to listen to the village chieftain. So they're going to join. So it was voluntary, but I would put that in quotes, that there is a certain amount of, forcing them to join and to increase these numbers. But they did fight for the honor of the village, because if you came back with medals, you got a good pension and you were quite the hero of the village, which is what, somebody like Darwan Singh became. And also I found it really touching that when he was presented his Victoria Cross, he was the first Indian to actually get this. And the king presented it to him. And they would often ask them, ask for a favor, ask for a wish. And so the king asked him, and he didn't ask for money, pension, land. I found it really moving that what he asked for, and this story was told to me by his son, Darwan, who is still alive, he lives in Lucknow. And he said that my father said, I want a school built in the village. And because they realized when they went abroad that what they needed was education in India. And the British honored that. They built this school and it's now a secondary school. It still survives. So for me, these stories were really moving that, it's very easy to dismiss them and say, oh, they just went for the money. It was a volunteer army. They were mercenaries. The last thing I would call them was mercenary, because that is not it. They may have signed up because they needed food, but that's different. But to ask, selflessly for a school, for literacy, he wanted a road built to his village, things like that. He was not asking for anything for himself. And I think that's what I'd like to take away from their stories and their contribution.
Dr. Kamtekar, I'll come to you in a minute. I have a quick follow-up question for Ms. Basu. General Singh earlier talked about that we have the names of the people who died in World War I at India Gate, and then post-independence we have them at the War Memorial. The ones, I guess 85,000 of those who died in World War II, their names are not really honored anywhere. And he also talked about earlier, like when I brought up the Mangal Pandey Battle of 1857 rebellion, that the sense of who is a legitimate government was not really there at the time. It wasn't clear. But now going back to World War II specifically, if we are going to focus on that, and that's from where some of your examples are from, at that time it must have been a lot more clearer. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi at that time asked people not to join this war. This was not our war. And still these people went and enthusiastically enrolled themselves. Were they against the movement for India's independence, or was there no consideration to the fact that this is the people who are fighting for independence don't want us to join? There is Subhash Chandra Bose, who later on goes and starts an army to fight against this. But then there is Mahatma Gandhi who's saying, stay passive, stay out of this, stay neutral. Like, where were those considerations in their mind?
I think there was obviously there were many reasons that led them to volunteer again and go out. 2.5 million this time. The numbers had increased. But also, the one person who was actually asked this question and who actually gave a reply, and to me that's really important, was Noor Khan. So she was called for an interview at the RAF, Royal Air Force, because she was part of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And she was called in for an interview, and they asked her, because this is 1942, when all the Congress, at the start of the war, all the Congress leaders were put in jail. And 1942 Quit India movement had happened, and she's very aware of this. Her family was strong believers in independence. Her father, was an admirer of Gandhi. And so she's asked that whose side will you support? How can we send you into this mission? And she's very clear. She's just 28 years old, but she says it, she says, at this juncture, it is important to fight this war, to win this war. But after the war is over, I will support Indian independence. And she is absolutely clear-cut in that. Because, I'm not saying that the ordinary soldier had seen Hitler's plans to, take over and actually reach India, which was there. So the war was our war as well. The Japanese were going to come in, and the Germans would come in from. So we had to defend our territory. That would happen. But that is not something that all the soldiers were privy to. They went in there as duty. They went in there as a job. They went in there to fight. And there were some who did think, like Noor, that this is a battle that had to be fought first. And that then home rule would be given to them. This was the thinking behind First World War as well. A lot of the government at the time thought that if we are supportive to the British in this hour of need, we will get home rule. That didn't happen.
The British had let them believe that, right? In the First World War,
and then the Second World War, they felt that there were quite a few who felt that if we serve in this, we will get independence, like Noor did. There were others who, in a way, it's good that they went there. The Indian Air Force, especially, they went there, they were fighting, and they laid the foundation of the Indian Air Force, which, was to follow. Subrata Mukherjee. There were people like Jumbo Mazumdar, who, he died in the Second World War, but, their bravery led the foundation for this. So.
And do you see any contradiction here for us as contemporary Indians between if you look at just World War II, they were prisoners of war in Japan, who then defected and formed the Azad Hind Fauj, which we really have, now we are really honoring them. But then there were others who were prisoners of war and remained loyal. So are we to honor the ones who remain loyal, or are we the ones to honor the defectors? Who are the heroes?
It's not a clear question because it's the same thing that happened in Ireland. So the Irish soldiers as well. So immediately after independence, they didn't want to know the soldiers who'd fought, for the British. It is exactly the same story. But once a few years had passed, it's that time that you recognize that these people did their job. It's their bravery that then set off and actually inspired the army, the post-independent army that we had, the air force that we had, is all the foundations were laid by these people. These brave pilots, these brave army people. They were all, as General Naik said, that they were. This was the basis. The British Indian Army was then the basis of then the Second Army. The irony, of course, was that then it was divided, and those who had fought together in the Second World War, some then went to Pakistan and India and fought against each other. But that is, moving on. But yes, so it's not clear. But over the years, even the Irish now, there is a movement there now to recognize, to remember, to commemorate those soldiers who fought. So I think we share very parallel histories with Ireland and with India as to the dilemmas of independence, fighting a colonial power, but then also now recognizing them because times has moved on.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that example of Ireland. I think that's quite pertinent. But let me bring in now Dr. Kamtekar. I think it's, speaking of defectors, it's his time to defect now.
Before
I want to ask, let me put this question for you, and this might be my final question. So Dr. Basu, Ms. Basu talked about Ireland. I want to draw another example. The Confederate Army of the US. That's another example in history where the same people fought each other. Americans fought Americans. They were on both sides of the Civil War. No one questions the heroism or chivalry of the Southern Confederates, but the political aim of their war to restore slavery is so repugnant to the modern generation that it has become almost untenable to have monuments to them in public spaces. And that's what we are seeing right now playing out in the US. We are seeing this debate playing out live in the US. So who we honor today is a reflection of our contemporary values. If we unequivocally condemn colonization, how can we put the names of those who enabled the colonization to persist for so long in our places of honor?
Yeah. So, Yajur, if I may, let me just take up some of the issues, including the ones which you brought up and which Shrabani Basu and General Singh have mentioned. I have, as you would guess, a somewhat different take on them. So if you'll give me a few minutes, I'll take them up before I defect. Huh? So General Singh, I would say this, that the examples you have given are of Jallianwala Bagh, maybe 400 dead, maybe a little more. You've given the example of the Golden Temple operation. These are not examples of what an army is supposed to be all about. These are basically what in normal times would be policing operations. An army is meant to fight other armies. And there I have to differ with what you've said, because I would imagine that if it's fighting another serious army, orders have to be obeyed. It's one thing that a junior officer may express a differing point of view, but if he does not follow orders from higher ups, then end of army. If an army officer behaves as we encourage university students to do, or they do anyway, then end of army. Just as if in our universities, the students obey orders of their teachers, end of university. So I think obedience is something which has to be there in combat situations when the enemy is a serious one. Now, what is the culpability? Here it brings in a perspective from another discipline. There's a very famous experiment in psychology called the Milgram Experiment. These are known as obedience to authority experiments, and they have implications. So what happens in these experiments, or what Stanley Milgram did, was he, on a university campus, recruited people, and he said, we are doing a scientific experiment. It involves giving shocks to people to see what they can tolerate. So various volunteers were got. This was a scientific setup. There were the scientists in their white coats. Across a partition, there were the people who were being given electric shocks. And slowly, as it went on, the voltage to which the guinea pigs, if you like, were subjected increased till they began to scream with pain. The scientists said, continue giving the shocks. A few students hesitated. They were told by the scientists that you go ahead. And they did, till the other side was in agony. Now, as it happens, the people who were being given the shocks were Confederates. The idea was to check if, when we are told by people in authority, the normal human response is to obey authority, whether that holds. And it was found that indeed that was the case, that when we are told by somebody who is in authority that we should do something, the normal human response is to do it. Now, move the implications into how guilty were the Nazis. The idea there would be that they were behaving as you and I would as normal human beings. So there is that whole set of obedience to authority experiments which speaks directly to these situations and which reduces the culpability of ordinary people, of the people who are there. Now, as far as serving the British is concerned, yes, Gandhiji said, don't join the army. In fact, the slogan of the time was, na ek pai, na ek bhai. Do not contribute money, do not join. So we had no problem not contributing to government British finances. But to not take a job in those conditions, when a job was coming in a society hungry for employment, was difficult. So the way it worked out was that 2.5 million Indians joined the army. Now, they were just doing their job. There I agree completely with Shrabani. But do we have to honor people who are doing their job? It's not acknowledge. This, as I said, is the key word. To acknowledge is fine. To reveal complexity is fine. Why honor somebody who's doing his job? As far as the loyalty issue goes, yes, we try to have it both ways. We remember both the INA and the Indian Army. Remember that it is the British Indian Army, not the Indian National Army, which forms the armed forces of independent India. So as far as our leadership is concerned, there's no issue there. If I may, just let me now defect, if you can give me a minute or two. And now I'll make a case for why we should honor the soldiers of the British Indian Army. I would say that we need to honor them, and there is a kind of, let's say, divided mind which we have in this, which I want to put on the table, and which I think is in the proposal, the way you've put it to us, Yajur. We should honor the soldiers of the British Indian Army because in doing so, we show respect, perhaps we show gratitude towards our durable institutions, which is what General Singh said. And these are institutions we would not want to be without. We need those institutions. Independent India needed its British recruited ICS officers, Indian police officers, army officers. Now, this is the point. The history of India, as told in terms of freedom movement leaders, which is, Yajur, what you talked about, our school textbook history, it reads differently from the history of India told in terms of institutions. And those institutions are important. These institutions of independent India are not immaculate conceptions. They have a colonial paternity. It is this paternity which our nationalist common sense seeks to conceal. The concealment of continuity is what the nationalist project in the second half of the 20th century in India was all about. And there's a distortion of history which is involved. So please be aware that the practice, what independent India's leaders did, is very different from the kind of message which you get from the textbooks. The textbooks which are written by maybe, simple-minded court poets as historians, just maybe crafty mediocrities on the make, the way they've portrayed our Indian history. People should know, many people do not know, that the first Air Chief of India, the Navy Chief in independent India, was serving British officers. Where is that fact in our history textbooks? Till 1955, the name of India's naval chief was Admiral Sir Charles Peasy. Till 1954, the name of India's air chiefs had names like Sir Thomas Elmhurst, Admiral Chapman, Admiral Gibbs. Now, when I've taught this in the classroom, students say, well, do you mean Nehru could not find one Indian in the whole country to do these jobs? And my response is, you can interpret facts in different ways, but these facts are sacred. You can't sacrifice them to the altar of your generalization or your assumptions. So the point I'm making is, if you think of Indian history in terms of institutions, it looks different from freedom movement history. In practice, the nationalist leaders honored the personnel whom the British had recruited. Sir C.D. Deshmukh, ICS officer, joins 1918. He sits the exam in London. He becomes governor of the RBI in 1943. He's the finance minister of independent India 1950 to 56. H.M. Patel, Hirubhai Patel, joins the ICS in 1927. Morarji Desai makes him finance minister of India after the defeat of Indira Gandhi in the 1977 elections. In 1979, Charan Singh joins the Morarji cabinet. H.M. Patel becomes the Home Minister of India. He's an ICS officer, recruited by the British. Consider Dharamveer, joins ICS 1930, becomes Cabinet Secretary. 1966 to 67, he's Governor of Punjab. 69 to 72, he's Governor of West Bengal. Then he's Governor of Karnataka. 1999, as late as that, he's given the Padma Vibhushan. There are many other names, B.K. Nehru, B.D. Pandey, so on. Now, if they can be honored after serving the British, why should the poor soldiers be forgotten? Soldiers, as you said, Yajur, fight for governments. They fight to uphold the values of their upbringing. Abstract ideas may be poor motivators. They fight to avenge their comrades when they are wounded. That's a big deal in combat motivation. Now, these people serve a function. For the ICS, Patel said the Indian Union would have fallen apart if it wasn't for the ICS. That's why he said you must retain the Indian civil service. Otherwise, with a communal civil war going on, princely states to integrate, war with Pakistan, India might fall apart. What about the Indian Army? People will say, my students have said, one of them said, who did a PhD on the army, he said, my grandfather fought for the British Indian Army. My father fought for the Indian Army. My wife's father did. The children will join the armed forces. So soldiers fight for governments. They do not necessarily fight for ideologies. But think about this. The Indian soldier who has to stand before the Union Jack one day and to fight for the tricolor the next day against Pakistan or China, he could not possibly have changed his loyalty overnight. There was something much more going on in him than loyalty to the new nation state. It was loyalty to a tradition in which family, village, clan, regiment, everything is mingled. Namak, naam, nishan, there are many things. So we have to digest this, that the foundations of independent India's state are at least partially colonial. We've accepted this in practice, but we reject it in theory. To conclude, think of a structure like Rashtrapati Bhavan. It was once the Viceroy's house. After independence, we moved the President of India into it. Now, how do we react? We should appreciate its architecture. We can modify the building. As far as colonial institutions are concerned, we should think of reform, not of suicide or murder as far as our institutions are concerned. So I would say, don't demolish or undermine the building because you dislike the causes of its older inhabitants or the workers who built the structure. Honor the workers who built as fine a structure as Rashtrapati Bhavan, honor the soldiers who built the structure, which is the Indian Army. That is the case I would make after defection.
General Singh wanted to make a quick point, and after that, I'll come and conclude. So you're on mute. Request you to let me.
Yeah, Yajur, I'll just make 3-4 concluding points. And the first one, because the topic is important, I just quote Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was the CNC in India, and who asserted quite categorically that the British could not have prevailed in the two wars without the contribution of the British Indian Army, in fact, the contribution of India. So that puts to rest. The British acknowledge it. We have to, I'm sure we acknowledge it, but we can do more about it. The second point is, you have to understand the ethos of a soldier. A very noble profession, where he fights for Naam, Namak, Nishan. He also fights for the constitution and the legitimate government of the day. And we have discussed what were the options as far as legitimacy is concerned. Is the same way that his forefathers fought for centuries. Most of them have descended, one soldier after the other. Therefore, in my view, we do not pander to colonialism when we commemorate the soldiers of the Indian Army, and both Dr. Shrabani and Professor have made it amply clear on that. There is another word that I want to bring in. It would not be fair to conclude without that, and that is regimental spirit. You know, a lot of people ask me, you remember the Kargil War in 1999, and after the Pakistanis had occupied the ridge, the initial 1 month was not very good, and then India's response was strong, and we started evicting them, and we started getting the results. So somewhere in a discussion, one person told me, sir, we do appreciate the national spirit with which the soldiers have done this very, very challenging task. So I told him, yes, the nationalistic spirit and nationalism is always there in the background. But I asked this specifically to a soldier who actually later on was highly decorated. I said, what propelled you to do this suicidal mission? And you know what was his answer? He says, Saab, how could I have gone back to my village and face those elders? That was his motivation. And we call it the regimental spirit. And Shrabani did mention her experience. I've been to Lansdowne, and you can see how much they make of those two VCs. And I think it is right that we do that. One more important point that you brought up in this discussion was about discipline and obedience. And I think the professor did put it in perspective. I just want to bring up the Nuremberg Trials. You know, I just quote 2 examples. One was the trial of the camp commandant of Auschwitz. Okay. And he was asked this question during the trial as to what was your motivation to do this inhuman act as the camp commandant, to experiment with those victims. You know what was his answer? It was a military task that was given to me, and I tried to optimize it in the best possible way. Now, those are psychological and deep-rooted issues that have to be. Why did no person in the German Wehrmacht think it appropriate to confront Hitler? Some did, but they were sidelined. Okay, the second example is of their most famous general, von Manstein. He's remembered as their most brilliant strategist, and he was sentenced in the Nuremberg Trials. The Allies had great respect for him, yet they sentenced him. Of course, he was given release later. premature release from the prison. And the reason was, they said that while you were not directly involved in passing an order for the extermination of Jews, it was in your area of responsibility that a number of such heinous crimes took place. And you, as the superior commanding general, should have known of it and should have stopped it. So these are issues which are complex. And I would just say that higher the rank of the person who's involved, greater the responsibility for him. Not so much for the soldier. For him, it's an act and you can punish him as per the Army Act. There are enough avenues to punish him. But when it goes up the rank, it becomes a very, very serious issue, and that needs to be taken. Lastly, I spent a year in Soviet Union. In fact, I'm one of the few officers who have trained both in Moscow and London at the height of Cold War. And what amazed me, if one abiding memory that I carry from there is the great losses they suffered in the World War and the way they commemorate that and honor their soldiers. Every village square, every town square has the eternal flame burning there. And after marriage, the first port of call for the bride and bridegroom is that eternal flame. So in the end, Yajur, it's only for me to compliment you for this very interesting discussion, and more power to you. Hope to come on some other discussion, and my gratitude to the co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The discussion becomes interesting with the insights you bring in. Ms. Basu, you want to make brief closing remarks?
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you. This has really been interesting, and I really enjoyed listening to both General Singh and to Dr. Kamtekar. Excellent inputs, and one is learning every day, as always. Well, for me, I stick to my stand. I'm not crossing any any platforms that they should be remembered, commemorated, because they were Indians. At the end of the day, they came from villages in India, and they went out and did what they had to do. Some fought bravely against fascism, and we owe that to them in the Second World War. And the First World War was the most pointless war of all. They just died there, as did a lot of British and Germans and everybody else who also died in that campaign, in that war. So, but I think the greatest disservice we can do is just forget about them and erase them from history, because I think we need to remember their stories. They are human stories. They're human beings. What they did, what they encountered, and what they brought back. Because remember, these people came back to India. They were carrying what they'd learned in the West there. Garhwal Singh Negi wanted to come back and start a school. So there were little positives that came back with all of them. And, let's just remember the good things that happened because of this encounter. Very few stayed back. And then we had an Air Force in the Second World War, thanks to, these brave pilots that learned, that went out there, trained, and came back and, protected India against the Japanese attack, because that was the 14th Army and the Indian Air Force really doing their bit. And as General Singh said, that comment by General Locke, as he was called, is so potent that they wouldn't have done it without the Indians. They wouldn't have pulled through, I think was his exact words. So, we owe it to them. Otherwise, we might all have been speaking German right now. Who knows what would have happened? So, on that, let's hope that, we remember them once a year. I think, everyone needs to go. When I went to Neuve Chapelle, which is the Indian Memorial, it was really sad because there was nobody there. It was empty. And of course, I know that the descendants of those soldiers are very far away. They live in villages. They'd never be able to travel to France to see them. But once a year, I think the local UK Sikhs go there. They organize bus trips, which is still nice. And, the Indian government goes there, of course, the Indian embassy. And it is nice that they are remembered because it's a beautiful, beautiful sight. So many died. Over 4,000 Indians just died. So I think we need to remember all of them. And that's it, really. Keep telling their stories.
Dr. Kamtekar, Ms. Basu, General Singh, thanks to all of you for bringing such great arguments, which were packed with facts and reasoned and very articulate reasons based on your own research and experience. I think that's what Argumentative Indians aims to achieve by organizing these sessions. So thanks to all of you for making this a success. After your beautiful conclusions, I will not conclude. I will let viewers formulate their own opinions, having listened to your perspectives. Thank you for joining us today. Namaskar.